In 1890, the United States Census Bureau sat down and did something it had never done before. It tried to count the nation's millionaires. Not estimate, not guess, but actually count them, name by name, fortune by fortune. What they found was so strange, so concentrated, and so almost unbelievable that the report was buried in government archives for decades before historians finally started pulling it apart. There were roughly 4,047 millionaires in the entire country, in a nation of 63 million people. That number is already startling enough, but the real shock was not the size of the club, it was how the club got built. When researchers traced those fortunes back to their origins, the same surnames kept appearing, the same business partnerships, the same banks, the same railroad contracts, and the same land deals. When they pushed the origins far enough back, nearly every major Gilded Age dynasty traced its founding wealth to a window of roughly 40 years, somewhere between 1845 and 1885. Before that window, with very few exceptions, these families were nobody. They were farmers, clerks, and immigrants with almost nothing in their pockets. So the question that nobody in 1890 wanted to ask out loud was this: how did a handful of families go from nothing to controlling the economy of the most powerful industrializing nation on Earth in less than 2 human generations? And why did it happen to those specific families and not to the thousands of others who were standing in the same rooms, riding the same trains, and living through the same era? The answer is not what the textbooks taught you, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. To understand what happened, you have to understand what America looked like in 1845, because it barely resembles the country those 4,047 millionaires would come to dominate. There was no national railroad network, no federal income tax, no Securities and Exchange Commission, no Sherman Antitrust Act, and no Federal Reserve. The United States government collected most of its revenue from tariffs and land sales, and it spent most of that revenue on almost nothing. The country was a patchwork of regional economies, loosely stitched together by rivers, canals, and dirt roads. A merchant in Boston operated in a fundamentally different financial world than a merchant in Cincinnati. Capital did not move freely. Information moved even less freely. If you wanted to know the price of grain in St. Louis, you might wait 2 weeks for a newspaper to arrive. What existed in place of institutions were relationships. These were networks of trust built on family connections, church affiliations, ethnic ties, and the kind of reputation that could only be built slowly, face to face, over years of small deals done honestly. These networks were the invisible infrastructure of American commerce, and they were, for the most part, closed. The families who would become the dynasties of 1890 were almost universally already inside those networks by the time the Great Disruptions began. They were not rich or powerful yet, but they were connected. A young Cornelius Vanderbilt was ferrying passengers across New York Harbor because his family had been doing waterborne business in that region for generations. A young John D. Rockefeller got his first job as a bookkeeper through a family church connection in Cleveland. Jay Cooke, who would finance the Civil War and almost single-handedly invent the American bond market, came from a well-connected Ohio family with legal and political ties stretching back decades. This is not to say talent was irrelevant. These were, almost without exception, people of extraordinary ability, drive, and strategic intelligence. But talent in 1845 was everywhere. What was not everywhere was access, and access was the variable that separated the families who would explode into Gilded Age dynasties from the equally talented families who would not. The first great accelerant was the railroad, and the railroad did not reward those who built it nearly as much as it rewarded those who financed it. Between 1850 and 1870, the United States laid more railroad track than the rest of the world combined. The numbers are almost difficult to process. In 1840, the country had about 3,000 miles of track. By 1870, it had over 53,000 miles. This was not organic growth. This was a government-sponsored, land-subsidized, politically engineered explosion of infrastructure. The people who understood how to navigate the relationship between private capital and government contracts were positioned to capture extraordinary wealth from it. The federal government gave railroad companies more than 170 million acres of public land as incentive grants. To put that in perspective, that is an area larger than the state of Texas. The companies could sell that land, use it as collateral for loans, or develop it themselves. The families who held stock or bondholder positions in these companies did not need to know anything about engineering or lay a single rail. They needed to be in the room when the contracts were written. Cornelius Vanderbilt understood this earlier than almost anyone. By the time most people recognized that railroads were going to consolidate, Vanderbilt had already started consolidating them. He acquired the New York and Harlem Railroad in 1862, the Hudson River Railroad in 1864, and the New York Central in 1867. He was not building railroads, he was assembling a monopoly on the movement of people and goods into and out of the most commercially important city in America. When he died in 1877, he left an estate of roughly $100 million. Adjusted for the size of the economy at the time, it represented a share of American GDP that no individual fortune has matched since. What made Vanderbilt's trajectory possible was that he was operating in a period before the rules existed, before antitrust law, before securities regulation, and before the government had developed any serious mechanism for limiting the concentration of economic power. He was building inside a regulatory vacuum, and he was doing it with access to capital networks that were simply not available to the vast majority of Americans alive at the same moment. The same pattern repeated itself across every major Gilded Age dynasty, with small variations. Jay Cooke used his Philadelphia banking connections and his relationship with Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase to become the exclusive distributor of Union war bonds during the Civil War. He sold $1.6 billion in bonds to the American public, taking a commission on every single one. He effectively invented retail investment banking in America, and he did it with a government monopoly that no competitor could touch. Andrew Carnegie arrived in Pittsburgh as a poor Scottish immigrant, but his first real break came when he became the personal secretary to Thomas Scott, a senior executive at the Pennsylvania Railroad. Scott recognized Carnegie's organizational abilities and began cutting him into investment opportunities that would otherwise have been invisible to a young man of his background. Carnegie's first significant investments were in railroad sleeping cars and railroad bridges. By the time he pivoted to steel, he had been inside the financial networks of industrial America for 20 years. John D. Rockefeller's rise followed a slightly different path but the same fundamental logic. He recognized that oil refining, not oil drilling, was where durable wealth would accumulate. Drilling was a lottery. Refining was a business. But controlling refining required something else first, something that most of his contemporaries failed to see clearly enough. It required controlling the railroads that moved the oil. Rockefeller negotiated secret rebate agreements with the major railroads, agreements in which Standard Oil would receive steep discounts on its shipping rates in exchange for guaranteed volume. Some of these agreements went even further. The railroads actually paid Rockefeller a portion of the shipping fees that his competitors were paying. His competitors were unknowingly subsidizing his expansion. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of American refining.
It was not because Rockefeller made better oil, it was because he had locked up the logistics infrastructure that every refiner depended on. The families that did not make it into the Gilded Age aristocracy were not, by and large, less capable. The historical record is full of entrepreneurs and industrialists from the 1850s and 1860s who built real businesses, made real money, and then found themselves unable to survive contact with the dynasties that were forming around them. The difference was almost always the same: access to capital at the right moment, the right relationship with a government official who controlled a contract, or a bank connection that allowed survival through a financial panic when competitors were being wiped out. The Panic of 1873 is the clearest example. Jay Cook's banking house collapsed and triggered the worst economic depression America had experienced to that point. Thousands of businesses failed, and hundreds of thousands of workers lost